The idea of voting for the lesser of two evils. Not even that convinces me this year to vote conventionally, when the two conventional parties' candidates are so terrible. In late 2022, I wrote a list of predictions for upcoming years. On that list, I predicted Donald Trump and Joe Biden would run for president in 2024, but both would be out of the race by March. Trump is still in hot water from the January 6th riot, and I hear Biden has low approval rating even among Democrats. Because of my distrust in American politics, I wasn't expecting good candidates to replace them, but I was curious about seeing some new faces. You can then imagine my disappointment when I learned we're getting a 2020 rematch. It feels like we've reached a new low in American elections. I've learned to expect bad candidates, but at least you would get to see some new bad candidates. It's extra insulting that our two main choices this year are the same two we had last time, and both have been president, so we've seen their performance in action. There's an idea of voting for the lesser evil, and while I've taken that approach in the past, my current plan for this year is to go against the flow and vote third party, and I'll explain why in this video. You can still watch this even if you don't agree with everything I say. Whether you lean left or right, perhaps you'll agree with some of what I say here as a conservative Christian, because I observe the citizen Democrats and Republicans have disapproval with their so-called representatives. Let's go over the two big parties. With what I just said, you may have guessed I'm not part of the Democrat Party, and that's correct. At least because I'm against their cultural stances. Looking at the culture war, it appears even more intense so far this decade. I have been hearing more extreme views from some leftists, and not just from the citizen Democrats. Who else here has heard of the controversial bill AB 957 that California was pushing, which would charge parents with child abuse if they so-called misgender their trans child? I was against the LGBT even before this, so it's no surprise I'm against this too. But it's not just conservatives like me who are opposing stuff like this. Even some people with left-wing views think the left is going too far, whether it be with AB 957, accusing white people of being racist just for being white, or something else. It's crazy some leftists have gotten so extreme they're getting criticism from other leftists. I suspect a considerable portion of Democrat voters are becoming more distrustful in their party, and even if they haven't heard of the examples I just stated, they might suspect their party could fall into this extreme in future years. And I have only covered the Democratic Party in relation to the culture war. Another major category of political debate is on the economy, and leftist citizens also have an issue with how their representatives act on economic policy, or rather how they don't act. I watched a video by Johnny Harris where he compared leftist politicians' words with their actions. He found that even in places where Democrats dominate, the politicians are complacent on changing the economy, and others feel the same. And even if the Democrats' economic ideas were correct, this hypocrisy and lack of action deters voters. Many people vote for a party based on what the party says they'll do if they win. But what's the point in voting for a party if they aren't reliable in their actions? But what about the other big party? Well, for 2024, we have Donald Trump. And before that, we had Donald Trump. And before that, we had Donald Trump. Trump has been the Republican Party's favored candidate for the last 3 elections. Paired with his unique personality, he's been an iconic politician for so long it feels weird to think back on a time when he wasn't running for president. You would hope that for someone that manages to maintain popularity with a party for 3 consecutive elections, that candidate would be an excellent one. But I'm disappointed. I remember back in 2016 having at least one problem with Trump, one that I still hold today. I think building a wall is impractical. I support immigrants coming here legally, but I think a wall would be a waste of money. Even if it was cheap to build, the US-Mexico border is over 1,000 miles long and illegal immigrants would only need to cross at a single point. That wall is only as strong as its weakest segment. Instead, maybe we could simplify the process of legal immigration to encourage foreigners to take the proper way in. I also have a problem with Trump's personality. Sure, I admit he seems proactive, which is a valuable trait when one is running a country, but I also find him to be arrogant. Who else remembers his first 2020 debate with Joe Biden? Yeah, I'm bracing myself for the rematch debates this year. But again, though I've had a problem with Trump in all three elections, I preferred him over Hillary in 2016, and when I was old enough to vote in 2020, I voted for him because I believed Biden would be worse. Okay, it's 2024 now. We have the same candidates as last time, so why am I not voting for Trump again? This may have already come to mind for you. I remember soon after hearing about the January 6th riot, I was thinking, I voted for that guy? But do remember, we deal with American media, so I wanted to examine it deeper. I heard multiple people claiming Trump in his speech before the riot told the protesters to express opposition in peaceful fashion. Maybe the liberal media just cut that part out to support their narrative, although I haven't found a clip of him saying to protest peacefully. But even if he did, I have another suspicion. You know how Trump eventually told the rioters to stop? According to my research, Trump said this over 2 hours after the riot started. With how urgent a situation like a riot would be at one of the country's major political sites, I would expect someone like Trump, who, as I said, seems proactive, I would expect Trump to handle that situation sooner. With how long Trump waited to address the riot, I suspect he wasn't sincere about wanting the rioters to stand down and was saying this to puff up a false public image. On top of this controversial dates in American history, there's that more recent statement when Trump said he wouldn't protect underpaying NATO members and would encourage Russia to do what they want. Not protecting non-paying members is more debatable, but Trump also said he would encourage Russia to actively be aggressive. We've heard about what Russia has done to Ukraine, and Trump is condoning that behavior on other countries. Aside from Trump himself, there's also the fact that I too have changed since 2020. I'm still culturally conservative, but economically, I have a more critical view of capitalism than I did 4 years ago. And the Republican Party is typically a more pro-capitalist party. Overall, I have a more negative view of Trump than I did in the previous two elections. With the way that, with the updates on Trump in the last 4 years, he has gone from I'm willing to vote for him to he and Biden are both so disgustingly awful choices. I had a hard time picking even with the lesser evil approach. So, what then? When I was starting to think about voting for a third party, I didn't have a specific candidate in mind. Yet, I wanted this. At the least, I would rather vote for no one than to not vote at all. What I mean by voting for no one is I would put in a ballot but not specify a candidate. I know someone who did this in 2016. He chose the write-in option and simply wrote that there weren't good candidates. The reason I would prefer something like this is because it still shows I'm willing to spend the time to vote. But about third parties, a relevant question is why third parties struggle to compete. I could be wrong here, but as a participating voter, a theory I have is the two main parties are so big that voters want people with similar values to gain a large sum of votes in a single party. For an example, imagine if a group had 3 food options to vote on: tacos, burritos, or sushi. 30% voted for tacos, 30% for burritos, and 40% for sushi. In one type of democratic system, sushi would have won because no other option has a higher percentage of the votes. But hold on, tacos and burritos are extremely similar. So maybe the people who voted for tacos or burritos would have been content with either. There's a different system called ranked choice voting which could fix some of this, but that's not what we got in America. I've heard people say not to vote for a third candidate because it's wasting your vote, and I think that's why so many people, or at least there aren't more people voting for a third party. But if all our choices are trash, our votes are trash too. In such a circumstance, people could be more likely to vote for something else because they have a lot less to lose. And that brings up something huge I want to emphasize. Something to distinguish the reason people are voting for smaller parties. I think Americans have less of a problem with the duopoly and more of a problem with repeatedly getting bad candidates. I still think the duopoly is a problem, but if either of the two main parties put forth a candidate that aligned with my values and had the attributes required for leadership, that's the type of person I would vote for. Yes, I said either of the two parties. It's not about red or blue, it's about deeper values. Not even the Republican Party can put forth a jerk and expect me to approve of him or her just for having the red label. Some theorize American politicians of both major parties want to keep the system under a duopoly control, and I find the theory to be plausible. By suppressing smaller rival parties, the two major parties have less competition. Both parties must still face each other, but they have a better survival rate having only one big rival instead of five or so. Whether that's a reason or not for the duopoly, the two-party system exists, and I think a third-party victory is unlikely. Even still, I find voting third-party appealing because it's also about making a statement. You don't always win in life, so you find other victories to celebrate. And in this case, it can be a breath of fresh air not to play this rigged game. I also think a third party will still get a higher than usual percent. A January poll found that 37% of voters would somewhat or seriously consider voting third party in a Trump-Biden rematch, which makes sense considering the situation. And I wouldn't even be surprised if that statistic is even higher now. And if a third party ends up getting a high enough vote count, I wonder if that might convince voters in future elections to adhere less to the two major parties. You could say the Democrat and Republican parties have been the two conventional parties. Note that not only does each election come down to two major parties, it's also the same two parties every time. I think some people decide to go for one of these main two because they've built up a reputation for being big. And since they don't want the big party that's worse to win, they vote for the big party that they find less evil, which keeps the big parties big. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Ironically, in a two-party system, one party's rival might be one of their biggest assets because it allows them to control their voters with fear, and then they're less accountable. They don't need to be good to win. They can just be less bad than their rival. But if a third party hits hard enough, maybe it'll shake up the two-party convention and get formally hesitant voters to actively try other options. This could even take the form of a third party not taking first but still taking second. In such a scenario, that third party wouldn't have won the presidency, but they still would have beaten one of the big parties. That could get voters thinking. One of the big parties got beaten by a third party. If we perceive that big party to be capable of contesting in an election, why not think the same of that third party? And hey, if a third party did somehow take first place, people would go wild. He or she would be the first president that was at least somewhat third party since 1869. The election would massively hit the two-party mindset, and I wonder how the current two major parties would handle it. Presidents from both sides get criticism from the opposing party, but if a third-party politician holds the high-profile position, what then will the other parties do? They might criticize this new president, as is their reputation, but it wouldn't fit into their us versus them narrative. Speaking of that narrative, I'm heading into closing thoughts now. After just 2 decades of living, my young, energetic self is tired of how much American politics has become factionalized. And note, if the other side's views are indeed wrong, it's okay to think so. If I take something like the trans controversy, I do think the trans movement is wrong and threatens to decay more of our country's dwindling sanity. But a problem I do have with the us versus them narrative is that, at least in America, it's a toxic mindset. Some people are too focused on their pride in a debate that they forget to see their opponents as people to love. Instead, they see their opponents merely as piñatas to debunk in flaring fashion. They have become like Jonah, accepting God's love, but not realizing God delights in extending that same love to the repenting Ninevites. Another closing thought I have is about how democracy has done in history. There was a time of transition when countries were abandoning monarchies and adopting a more democratic system to decide how a country runs. Some people today think we've gotten rid of that, but we have not fully. I suspect, even in Western countries, There are corrupt politicians and billionaires who, if they had instead lived in a medieval monarchy, would seek to seize power in non-democratic ways. In reality, they do live in a democracy and they might even claim to support it, but inwardly, they see democracy as a barrier to their ambitions. You might think, don't those idiots know democracy isn't supposed to work like that? But the truth is, they do know how democracy is supposed to function. They just don't care. And it's even more disgusting when they're trying to manipulate an election. If they win, they decide to paint themselves as the good guys, saying, hey, we live in a democracy, we won fair and square. Even if they aren't backpedaling society, they still focus too much on their pride. I feel like so many politicians are fighting for a particular side not because they're bold believers in the cause, but rather that they want the spotlight, being like whitewashed tombs having a beautiful outside but a rotten inside. Citizens of the United States have observed their country is ironically not very united, but an instance of unity many of us share this year is a desire to cleanse the toxicity. Left or right, many of us are tired. Tired of the bickering, the vanity shows, and the legalistic shenanigans. I'm not expecting it to get better, but that doesn't stop me from trying. Whether Trump or Biden wins, the other side is going to be furious. And if a third party wins, it'll be a wild ride. Even if such a party successfully improves the country, people will be anxiously watching along the way. Buckle up for the next 4 years. But despite the circumstances of this country's outlandish political sparring, I have heard a reassuring statement from elections past. Let's remember that whoever wins this, God is still in control. I know not everyone thinks that way, but for us who believe God has more power than these earthly nations, we have hope that is better than what worldly people have. Our hope is not conditional on who wins an election or a war. Yes, I'm a U.S. citizen, but my citizenship for Christ takes priority. Even if we got delightful candidates for the rest of this country's history, every earthly country, no matter how great, pales in comparison to the kingdom of God. And yet, it's hard to stay optimistic. What I'm disappointed about on this matter is not being optimistic about enjoying an eternal utopia, but rather struggling to internalize it on a deeper level. It's like being on a zip line and logically you trust the safety equipment so much you literally jump off, but there's still that anxious feeling. Even though I was just talking about the church's optimism for eternity, for some reason anxiety still gnaws at us. Not to say that feelings should replace logic, but if from a perspective of logic we believe Jesus will come back, we should bolster our optimism and remember that the president runs the country, but God runs the universe.